Well, welcome back to the Atheist Christian Book Club for what's supposed to be the second hour, but we're running about a half an hour late apparently. So we may take the liberty of stretching this one a little bit longer if we're all having a good time. I did want to talk about what our next two books are going to be. We have a flyer. If you want to go ahead and take one of these and pass it around. For our Christian book, I thought we might want to try this book called Not God's Type by Dr. Holly Ordway. She is a former atheist. She tells her story about why she never really refuted Christianity because she didn't think it was worth refuting. So, but she tells a story about how she began to have questions about God and began to explore the Bible. And she is actually the chair of the apologetics department at Houston Baptist University, which has one of the most recognized apologetic programs of any evangelical college or university probably in the country. And so she chairs that. This is her book, Not God's Type. I've read about 70% of it. You can read it in about 3.5 hours, 3 hours 15 minutes. It's a story. It's not very technical. It's going to make great light summer reading. Yes. You ought to be able to blow through it real quickly. And but it's our first woman author, so we're still looking for that atheist woman that can be maybe have a women's book that we could do from an atheist perspective. But there is Christianity Today did a cover story about 7 or 8 years ago, The Women of Apologetics. And Christianity has a resurgence of Mary Jo Sharp and Nancy Pearcey and obviously Holly Ordway and a number of other women who are not just teaching, but are actually on a university or seminary level, equipping people in that area, speaking in churches, writing books, obviously, on the topic. So that's going to be August 3rd, our next book club. The book's available. I'll send you links where you can get it on Amazon. I don't think there's an audio version. I haven't found that yet. But we're looking forward to that. And keeping with that theme, since we're dealing with testimonies of conversion, we'll do a deconversion testimony the following month. So in September, I've asked Ken if he would grace us with his presence for us to be able to talk about his book. His book is entitled Why I Believed. And do you want to say a couple of words about it just to kind of make us want to really go out and buy it and read it real quick?
So I first wanted to say, when I first came here, I had no thought of this becoming a thing. I didn't even want to let people know that I had a book. So I've enjoyed just the company of the people here. That's the primary reason I came. But people got wind that I had written a book, and so I went ahead and assented to let it be the next book after the one coming out. It's just basically tells the story in the first probably 4 chapters of my growing up as an evangelical missionary kid, and then later as a missionary myself, along with my wife in Africa, a missionary Bible translator, and then sort of the doubts that crept into my mind as time went on as I read the Bible and was troubled by various passages and eventually deconverted. So I tell the story of the deconversion. Then I go on to tell kind of why I used to believe, probably 7 or 8 main reasons why I used to believe, and then examine each of those reasons and explain why I now feel they fall short and indeed are problems for the faith itself. So I hope you enjoy it. It's a little bit long, but if you only get through the first 4 chapters, that pretty much will tell you who I am, where I came from.
Let me say something. When I heard about Ken's book, I thought, I'll give it a shot. I always read on Kindle. They give you the first chapter for free. I stayed up till 4 in the morning. I could not put the thing down. It was just amazing. And Ken has touched on irreducible complexity, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the moral problem, the cosmological orbit, everything we've talked about here, Ken touches on. And he has such insight. It's just unbelievable. I've been looking at this stuff for years, and I picked up lots of new stuff that Ken came up with. You just really got a really remarkable way about writing, Ken.
Well, it's very generous of you. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a theologian
Which is so amazing.
or scientist, but I do have the background. A lot of books like Richard Dawkins and Hitchens, they have a certain audience, but people that grew up in an evangelical background may not identify with their tone and approach. I try to be respectful, and I'm one of you. If you're an evangelical, I'm always one of you.
And just your doubts, the way he was just grasping at trying to get his faith back and so forth. I think he took a year off, or you came back for a year, and then the Christian said, "You're going to read Christian books for the next 3 months. I don't want you to read any."
Don't spoil the ending now.
Oh yeah.
So, and I will say one thing that that I wrote it 10 years ago, and so it isn't necessarily 100% faithful representation of what I currently believe, although it's probably 90% of that. I was influenced a lot by Robert Price, who is a mythicist, and at the time I didn't even know he was a mythicist. He was the one that kind of really got the ball rolling for me, and since then I've kind of put him to the side and gotten more in line with
you read like Dale Allison, heavy-duty scholars, don't
right.
you?
Our book, we're dealing with now is Bart Ehrman. How instrumental was he? I know with Bill, it was a big influence on Bill, his leaving the faith for atheism. How about you?
So I had already deconverted before I even heard of Ehrman or Dawkins or anybody like that. So, but since then, I've definitely read a lot of Ehrman, and I really respect him. I read his blog. Plug for his blog. It's $25 a year, and all the money goes to charity. And he answers your questions. If you want to ask him a question, if you say, "Bart, you're totally washed up," you go onto his blog, you ask him a question. The money that you give him is not going in his pocket. It goes to homeless charities in Research Triangle in North Carolina. So,
and speaking of money going in people's pockets, you'll love the fact that Kindle has Ken's book for 99 cents. However, you can get a free version of the book as well, I believe, on the web, can't you? Everything I clicked on opened up pages, so it looked like the whole book was there. Then that's almost pretty much the same book either way, right?
I'd rather us buy it.
well, I get 35 cents if you buy it on Kindle. If you buy the hard copy, I don't get anything. So,
I just did both. I just clicked for both.
Okay,
So
great.
you get 35 cents.
So I tried to make it so that nobody could accuse me of wanting to make a profit off of it.
So anyway, I read Ken's book.
Okay,
which,
so just for they're asking, the name of his book is available on Kindle. You can search for it on the web too. Ken Daniels is the author, and the title of the book is "Why I Believed." Past tense, believed.
So anyway, so James said, "Okay, I've read some of Holly's book," and I said, "Oh, I'm a little dubious about it," but I started reading that the same today. And I kept saying, I've got to put this book down because I've got to read this dry Bart Ehrman stuff. And he goes, did you get to the... I called James back and I said, this is just fantastic. I love it. And she used to be, has a PhD in English literature. So it's really neat how she draws like John Donne and C.S. Lewis and all these authors, and she talks about Tolkien and says it's the greatest book of the 20th century. So you're not only just getting Bible stuff, you're getting a lot of neat literature stuff. So he goes, did you get to the part where she got converted by her fencing coach? And I went, no, I got to read it. So I went all the way to chapter 21. But because I had to see
by the way. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, just ignore all that. Strike it from the record.
I think Ken's book, what little I've read of Ken's book, has a lot of firepower. I would call firepower to it, as far as strong, tight arguments, evidential stuff, the kind of things I like. I'm about 70% through. She doesn't focus on that so much. It's not about here's the 18 reasons why you should or shouldn't believe something, but it's a story, and in some ways communicates in ways that maybe facts don't. So it's light reading. It'll be an easy read. It's a change of pace. It's summertime. We ought to have this hot weather.
And I think it would be fantastic to get Ken and Holly to do a little debate, or he was saying more of a discussion where you're sitting in chairs. Because look at the foil. You have the atheist and, the Christian that Ken, and nobody doubts that he was a Christian. This guy, when you're going to Africa, when we were Christians, or before we became Christians, we were saying, God, please don't send me to Africa. Please. And Ken saying, send me to Africa. It's like, okay. So he's pretty hard. And Holly was a really committed atheist. What does she say? had no use for Christianity. They were all idiots and so forth.
Yeah, it's just a worldview issue, and you can identify with. It wasn't a disdain for Christians as much it was irrelevant. It was not even relevant to her. And when you read her story from a Christian background, I can understand that better now. I can kind of see how she would look at it that way.
So there's this thing called the Bible and Beer Consortium would be perfect for that because you have two deconversion stories. And James has actually been there. He debated a Muslim fellow. So real excited about these next 2 months, and should be fun reading for a change. Right?
And I'll get you links out to be able to get those, and I'll put them on the Facebook page as well. So again, last month we looked at how God became Jesus, and then this month we're looking at Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, trying to look at both sides of it. We are running a little bit late. I'd like to get to this next, which I think is pretty interesting, the next part of the interview, if we can. This is Bill Cluck interviewing Michael Bird on the topic of how Jesus became God.
Well, it's sad because, and I wanted to say, during your Gerd Herdman debate, that you were saying how atheists are stupid for saying there's no Jesus, that Jesus didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
But I want you to know that there are atheists, some atheists that do believe Jesus existed and believe there's good historical reasons for his existence. Being baptized in the Jordan River by John, the criteria of embarrassment and so forth. And but a lot of Christians couldn't put Jesus in history if their life depended on it. They have no idea what they believe. It's just sad. And the church is not doing a good job of, educating them, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's some of the things I get from first-year students just scare the heebie-jeebies out of me. People who don't know whether, did Abraham come before Moses? Or, some, basic biblical knowledge. And, I mean, a lot of them do have a pretty good Bible knowledge. It's not all, but you get some who have been, when you've got a very consumerist Christianity and the people are preaching sort of pop psychology or vague moral or theological platitudes.
Welcome to Dallas and Houston. I mean, we got Joel Osteen down Houston, and here the home of the mega churches. Go ahead.
Yeah, I visit Texas once a year, and I've seen a little bit of this. I mean, we have it a little bit in Australia as well. We have a little bit in Australia. We have Hillsong.
Oh, I don't know.
We have Hillsong in Australia where they sing such great hymns like "Jesus, you're terrific. For you, I'd swim the Pacific. Yeah, baby, yeah, baby, yeah, yeah, yeah." If that's the kind of hymns or choruses you're kind of nurtured on in your spirituality, it's going to be about as deep as a car park puddle. So, yeah.
Well, let me get back to the Christology. Doesn't Bart Ehrman believe in Philippians that you do have a sense of Jesus' high Christology, of him being, he didn't want to grasp divinity, but, he left all that, and it just indicates that he was there in the first place. And in Colossians, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. He does believe that early on Jesus' followers had or does he? I mean,
yeah, he does. He argues, I think, I'm just going from memory now, it's been so long. He argues at one point that in Galatians, Paul thought Jesus was an angel who became human. Now, I've heard that view before. It's based on a couple of things in Galatians, but I'll be honest with you. I did not find that all persuasive. Yeah.
I thought it was one of his weakest arguments.
Yeah. The Philippians text is a lot more interesting because the Greek grammar is very clunky and complex. And in Philippians 2, the issue is equality with God, something that Jesus did not grasp after, but he ended up with all the same, or is it something he already had, but he refused to exploit? And I mean, I remember being in a Bible study where a lady read the old King James, where it said, Jesus did not consider robbery to be equal with God. I mean, that's the old King James language.
It
No one
actually
had
says
that.
that. Wow.
That's, I mean, no one's got the idea. And again, even the NIV has changed over the years in their translation, going from he did not consider equality, well, he did not consider himself to be equal to God, or something like that. But then they've changed it to did not consider equality to God something to be exploited. So it is a very difficult text. I tend to think it's more the latter, that equality with God is something he possessed but refused to exploit for his own self-aggrandizement. So, yeah.
And again, I remember Ken said that you were a little hard on Bart because you said Bart rejects, says the scriptures are hopelessly corrupted, it has 100,000 variants. But Bart indeed said that most of those are minor. Now, he does say, which a lot of Christians get wrong, when I asked him this personally, I said, are there any things that affect theological doctrine? He said, I could make a list as long as my arm. So he does make that distinction. He would definitely say there's authentic sayings of Jesus and history in the, wouldn't you say? Yeah.
The problem is you have to differentiate Bart, the text critical scholar, from Bart, the I don't mean this derogatory, but Bart the showman. Bart, he is a brilliant communicator. I mean, I have to say, I think Bart Ehrman is a genius. I'll tell you why. He took the most boring and banal area of text criticism. I mean, this is like taking a book on the reproductive habits of plankton and turning it into a New York Times bestseller. This is the most dull and boring area of biblical study. It moves at like a glacial pace, and yet he turned into a New York Times bestseller and has made a stash of cash ever since then. So I think the guy is in that level is a genius. And that's because he can do the scholarly stuff, but he also knows how to work a crowd. He knows how to do good media. And the fact of the matter is, as I say in the book, I spent my 38th birthday listening to him to say repeatedly to a room full of scholars, you know, we can't talk about the Word of God. We don't even know what the original words even were. So he makes statements like that, which are very provocative, very rhetorical. They're going to get like a certain response from people. But if you then go back and talk to him and say, okay, are you telling me that the whole manuscript tradition is messed up? In which case, how do you write books on Jesus and use these messed up manuscripts? I think I had a valid objection, given what Bart can say in print, in media, and in person. Now, I know Bart, in his more reasoned and scrutinized environments, will be a bit more robust and careful and less rhetorical in what he says. But Dan Wallace said the same thing. It often depends which Bart you're debating, whether you're debating Bart the text critic or Bart sort of the public scholar of religion.
Well, and he uses the example of, you know, in Mark where it says, you know, Jesus was compassionate toward the leper, and the other one reading from the other manuscripts are like, gosh, if I have to heal one more leper, I'm going to go crazy. And he was angry at the leper. So he would agree that you go to the harder translation, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, that's a good example of where you have a verse where it is a difficult text because of the manuscript evidence is a little bit split, and you have to come up reasons as to which one. So there are some difficult readings where the evidence is fairly evenly split. Another good one would be Romans 5:1. Is that, you know, we have peace with God, or let us have peace with God. I think it's probably a little bit more closer to let us have peace with God, but people, usually for theological reasons, prefer the other one. So there are a few places where we wonder what the precise word was there. But Mike Holmes has got a good way of putting it. He says, look, at the micro level of individual words, the odd phrase here and there are some difficult places, you know. And then you've got some of those things like, you know, the woman caught adultery and the longer ending of Mark. But generally, the macro structure of the Gospels is pretty consistent and reliable across the manuscript tradition. The micro level, yeah, there are a whole bunch of individual variants. In fact, you know, hundreds and thousands of them. But at the macro level, it's fairly consistent, particularly compared to manuscripts of the Church Fathers, where you can have like whole books or whole chapters missing, or in the case of the works of Origen stuff is quite textually messed up because his memory was damned, and some people kind of did translations of his work and then added stuff in because they wanted to excuse him, or they wanted to exonerate him, or they wanted to damn him further. So, I mean, compared to other areas, I mean, our manuscript tradition is pretty good. But again, there are some individual places where we do scratch our head, was Jesus angry, or was he moved with compassion? Which one was it?
So, is that your understanding, that last thing we're saying, that Bart Ehrman, while he makes these statements that sound really, really severe, we don't even know the Word of God because we don't even know what the words are, but then really he fairly deals with the text in such a way to say, hey, there's a great manuscript evidence. I'm going to make a case why I think this reading was the best reading, and we can recover the words because, so how do you look at it? Which is Bart Ehrman? Where's he really coming from, based on that book we read?
Well, it depends on what your purpose is. If you want to know generally what it's talking about in a general sense, I mean, yeah, we know at a macro level, like Michael Bird was saying, we know what it's saying. But if you want to know the exact words, if you're obsessed with the inerrant, original autographs of what the Word of God really is, word for word, we don't have that. So in a sense, yeah, he's using that rhetorically and perhaps making a sensational point about it, but it is true that if you come, like my parents on my mother's side were all independent fundamental Baptists, and so KJV only, and that was inspired by the idea that between the cover of this KJV 1611 version of the Bible, we have the exact words of God, in a sense.
Which is actually based on the 1769 revision. That we're not going to yeah, I know what you're talking about.
That's a myth. That doesn't exist. The Word of God as the exact words inspired in the original, we don't have that.
So Paul didn't use the King James Version.
It's good enough for Paul.
Well, let me ask you, what other are some Christian misconceptions about how we got the Bible that even as Christians we can agree that this is a misconception? I think that would be one of them. But are there other things that I don't think many Christians believe that the Bible floated down on a parachute one day? But are there other misconceptions that Christians have that Bart Ehrman helped to see would help to kind of show a better picture of that, more accurate picture?
Well, the question would be, if God could inspire these inerrant words of God, it could inspire these manuscripts, why couldn't he preserve them? He has the ability to inspire it. Why doesn't he have the ability to? Because everybody agrees we do not have the original autographs. We have copies of copies of copies. So
I want to give you a hard time for saying everybody. I think he has. I mean, where are we at? We have 40 lines. There's 40 lines that have not been verified through textual criticism. I think he has preserved his word. I mean, we're at 99.5%. 40 lines of textual criticism.
One of the benefits of these copies, is it's a great backup and redundancy plan. Mm-hmm. So if you have one copy, of the Quran or any scripture, let's say John's Gospel, Mark's Gospel, you have only one copy. How do we know it's not been tampered with and things? But when you have all these multiple copies on several continents and, early copies, later copies, if I want to change and add something to Mark's Gospel, it becomes virtually impossible. I'm going to have to go through and change every manuscript out there, including the ones that haven't been discovered yet. And so in a sense, yes, it would be nice if we had a handwritten photocopy, photocopy of the handwritten first draft of Mark's Gospel. That would be nice, but to say that we can't know, and I don't think Bart Ehrman's saying that either, that we can't know anything about what Mark said.
Well, he goes the harder reading, like Jesus angry at the leper. You choose the harder reading rather than the smoothed over one where the priest said, we can't have Jesus angry. That makes him look too much like a, guy that can't control his temper.
So it's the textual principle of whatever makes Jesus look worse is probably true.
Well, just like the dissimilarity.
Well, but I think Bill's point is true, is well taken, regardless of whether it's 40 lines or 400 or 4,000 lines. The fact is, we don't know 100% for sure what the original was. You look in the Old Testament, there's passages like in Nehemiah that with numbers of chalices brought into the temple, and there's parallel passages in Second Chronicles or whatever, and the numbers diverge wildly. I mean, and so the usual approach is to say, well, in the original they agreed, but these are copies of copies, and therefore that's why the numbers have diverged. Well, we know we have differences. We know we have errors in the text that we have, right? So, and Bill's point is, and this is one of the things that actually led me away from inerrancy initially was, well, yeah, if God is capable of inspiring the original, he should well be able to preserve the text, the inspired original text. And we have the Declaration of Independence. There's no doubt about exactly what that says. We have the originals, and even in the Quran, there's the number of variants is much fewer than there are in the biblical.
So, what did you think when you start first noticing?
Let me just say on that. I just wrote a book on the topic. So it's the Quran that we have is based on what's called the Uthmanic recension, because Uthman III, rightly guided caliph, demanded every earlier copy be destroyed.
Right.
So we don't have any of the early manuscripts of the Quran. We have Uthman's recension, his redaction.
And there's hadiths that talk about that, about guys saying, this wasn't in there, and I'm still going to recite it that way because that's what I know that it is. And so they actually have a really big problem when they claim that they don't have it.
But point's taken, if God, now I would say, if God could inspire the Bible, why can't he preserve the Bible? I would say, the very fact that we have the copies, even with the variants in them, is part of God's preservation of his word, that God superseded that. Why didn't we lose 1 Corinthians? Ultimately, because God didn't want us to. And he would, if we know there was another letter to the Corinthians we don't have. Why don't we have it? Obviously, if God wanted us to have it, we would. But so, in a sense, you can believe in God and believe that God is basically supervising the whole process, so that what we have, while not identical, I'll agree with that, is nevertheless very reliable, the word.
But it's not so care about inerrancy. Maybe he doesn't care as much about inerrancy as
or maybe he
his
just
followers.
Like in your book, Ken, which I enjoyed reading the verse in Judges where it says God could not defeat the
Iron Chariot, or
the group,
the people in the plains.
The people in the plains, because they had iron chariots. So God's going, oh my gosh, iron. I cannot deal with that. Maybe some bows and arrows, but that's where I stop.
Ken, do you give the evangelical response to that passage?
No, that was just one of the random passages I listed. I didn't focus on that one very much.
Okay.
But when did you start to realize that you didn't have an inerrant book? When you were translating, did you see different?
It was a gradual process.
Okay.
We can talk about that later.
Okay.
Save some for second.
Yeah. I just wanted to give you a little preview.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions coming from online?
Yes. And my comments are scrambled, so I'm having a hard time. Hang on just a second. Carrie asked something a little earlier that I missed. Back up. And now I won't be able to find it.
Yeah, I don't think Carrie would mind me saying this about her. Carrie's a long-time friend. I met her when she was a Mormon. And she has a long... Anyway, we talked a lot about Mormonism and why I wasn't a Mormon anymore. She deconverted from Mormonism and is now Jewish. So I told her she should identify herself because she's going to confuse the Christians and the atheists. That's where she's coming from. She does believe in God. My point is, she does believe in God. She doesn't believe in Jesus.
I did find her comment.
Okay, great.
And the screen just moved. Okay. The guy sitting next to James, which I'm assuming is Bill, makes a good point about the authorities thinking that he was calling himself God, but were they right in their interpretation? Because under Pilate, he only stated he was king of the Jews.
So who was the question to?
She said the guy next to
Oh,
James.
okay. That was just a comment. Okay.
Well, she reiterated it. My comments are scrambled, and some are coming in top and bottom, and I made a comment, is there anything you want me to mention? And Carrie asked if I had seen it.
Okay, we'll read that one more time. So she
Okay.
said,
The guy sitting next to James makes a good point about the authorities thinking that he was calling himself God, but were they right in their interpretation? Because under Pilate, he only stated he was king of the Jews.
okay. I think John 8:58. You have John that whole chapter. Jesus is apparently making these claims of being God, and the Jews pick up stones because he's making himself God. That's blasphemy. He can't do that. So it's always possible that they misinterpreted Jesus, the Jews did, but you kind of think that they would know probably more what he was saying than we would. You know, you don't have the language barrier. You don't have they understood second century Judaism a lot better than we do. So I'm assuming that they understood Jesus correctly, although I will acknowledge that there were times they did misunderstand Jesus, so it doesn't mean that that's perfect. But I think they're in a good position to understand what Jesus was trying to say.
Or just like the Roman soldier, it says, truly, this was the Son of God. Well, you don't think he actually said that. That's what the storyteller put words in his mouth. And that's the whole thing, these criteria of dissimilarity in order. How can we tell what Jesus said and what the storyteller said? We don't. It's just guesswork. We don't. Even if we had the autographs, the original, things, that's just the gospel writer's opinion or invention. And these pre-literary traditions, which shows early on they believed he was God. Well, just because they believed it doesn't mean it's true. It means that's just the early traditions. Christians came to believe Jesus was exalted figure or God or whatever, but we just don't have any clue. We can guess.
Well, let's get this last clip from Bill.
Before
and
we do that, can I do one
sure.
more? I'd like to know what the group thinks about the validity of the resurrection claim, also if that would be sufficient evidence of Christ's divinity. That's what
Oh, Terry, you were talking about that.
Can you say that again?
Yes, I'd like to know what the group thinks about the validity of the resurrection claim, also if that would be sufficient evidence of Christ's divinity.
Well, I think you said Terry was 100% certain and you saw all sorts of evidence for it. Was that?
Yeah, that was pretty
Okay.
No, I said that if you think the Bible is the Word of God, then you have to say, you can't parcel it out and say, oh, well, on that story about the angels having sex with the women and creating giants, that didn't count. Somebody turned into, whose wife turned into salt?
Oh, yeah.
Lots.
Okay, Lot's wife. Oh, that wasn't true.
Right.
That wasn't true. That's not good enough. That one wasn't true. We're gonna cross that one out. But the resurrection, boy, somebody dies, jumps up, and comes back to life and comes out. Now that one we're gonna buy.
I agree with you on that. I think if you're going to deny miracles, deny the big ones. Don't deny the little one. Somebody walked on water. I mean, the two big ones is creation of the universe, okay, out of nothing, and then you have the resurrection. Those are the two big ones. And if you're going to deny the miraculous, you start with the big ones. You don't start with did an axe head float or can a man walk on water. So I agree with you on that. Do you think that there's Christians trying to do that, trying to say, well, that part's not a miracle?
Or they're saying it's figurative, or
Symbolic.
which would be.
Yeah, I guess in a way I do. I think people don't want to. I think that people kind of know that probably someone didn't walk on water unless you happen to know where the stones were. It's easy to walk on water if you know where the stones are. I think.
Yeah, but Peter walked on water too. So there goes that.
Oh yeah. Oh, and some have speculated that the feeding of the 5,000, that was actually the miracle of sharing it, that he didn't literally multiply the loaves. And
Just kind of teaching a story.
Yeah.
It didn't really happen.
So maybe, isn't it just as possible that the resurrection was to teach a story?
Well, the two words they use, the Christians use, is slippery slope. Exhibit A. Ken started doubting this, and pretty soon the whole thing just falls apart. Right? I mean, is that? Yeah.
I had a question. This is just like, what is the general understanding of why Christians can't believe in the resurrection from the atheist side? Like, what is the common explanation? They just
Well, Gerd Ludemann, who's the expert out of Germany, a great biblical scholar, says that when you have grief, when someone dies and so forth, you can only imagine the grief and cognitive dissonance Peter had. He denied him, he betrayed him. Then you're more likely to see visions. When someone close, this is research has been shown, when someone close, a family member dies, you see visions that Jim was talking about that seem really real. So that's their explanation, is that they agree something happened, that the disciples came to believe that Jesus is resurrected. They believed they saw visions. Not true, but that's what they believed. And then
go ahead.
Well, and also when someone dies, you see it in families all the time. Someone dies, and all of a sudden you forget that they were an alcoholic and beat their wife. This was the greatest part in the world.
Yeah.
You
see the good
that,
things.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, that person becomes almost godlike in the eyes of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And you look back and you're like, well, no, wait a minute. He was cheating on your mother. It wasn't.
And we're not talking about Jesus. Just to
No.
that
But
part.
I'm just saying that. So
Yeah, that's a good point.
we always begin to imagine things as better than we remembered them when they've gone away from us.
yeah, go ahead.
I had a question. And so I guess in terms of, if we just went with it was just kind of a delusion, or they just had a glorified, remembrance of Jesus, or they'd like to think that they saw them. I guess we see that in people who are psychotic, or people who are just mourning the loss of a loved one, where there is more of a psychological issue there. However, even if we look at the Bible as a historical document, and we take some of the things that were, I guess, explained, that they dined with him, that he appeared to more than 500 people, that he had spoken to people, that they, I guess, doubting Thomas, who stuck his finger through the palm of his hand. I guess, how would an atheist, or someone who is really interested in modern science, explain that there were not just one person who had these, visual apparitions, with Jesus, but not just a visual, seeing of him, but they heard him, they felt him.
Yeah, I can answer that very, very easily. John is not one gospel. When you see it crammed together, it's like 4 different parts, okay? Redacted. John 20, the fish fry at the Sea of Tiberias never happened. It was added later. It was an invention.
Can you give me a date for that?
Well, I can make a comment. As an atheist, I don't believe the Bible, so none of the stuff written in the Bible makes me believe the visions appeared.
Or the doubting Thomas thing, obviously.
Yeah, I think her point is, I think even Bart Ehrman would say they believed something happened, that there really were, he's not a mythicist, there really was a Jesus, there really was Paul, really existed, and these people thought that something had happened. And one of the possible explanations for that would be some kind of vision or hallucination. Now, one of the problems with that is typically people don't have the same hallucination. People hallucinate, yes, but you don't usually have a shared hallucination. You don't all hallucinate the same thing.
Well, you have Virgin Mary accounts that they do share with things. You have several people. And this one thing, the best evidence is this. Mark, I don't care what Michael Bird says, our unvarnished, bare bones gospel. What does it say when the women come to the tomb? They go and tell nobody. Just imagine Matthew and Luke and John reading that and going, well, this isn't going to do. I mean, we got to have some appearances here. So let's create this doubting Thomas, this skeptic that turns believe. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
The 500, that was not 500 witnesses. That was one guy writing about 500 witnesses. Yeah. Doubting Thomas, read the passage. He never actually touches Jesus. He doesn't stick his fingers in. We just embellish that in our heads. It's not in the Bible.
I was going to say something.
Yeah. People claim to see Elvis to this day at the Waffle House in Chattanooga or whatever, and they talk about it. So there's sightings, Tupac Shakur sightings or whatever. You don't necessarily have to be delusional or psychotic. I think sometimes Like if you really love R&B or rap music, and maybe you want Tupac to still be around, I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
And which leads me to my last point, that these people really wanted Jesus to be around. He was supposed to be their Messiah, the Messiah, the one that was going to deliver them out of Roman bondage. And it was going to be by the sword. That was the original prophecy, by the sword. He was going to lead them out by force. And so when he gets strung up, they're like, oh, you know, of course that's the ultimate, I have to go into this, my little shell of denial now.
Well, and like Chris made a good point, the disciples are like, well, this thing didn't work out the way we thought it would. He's got crucified instead of delivering us from the Romans. And what did you say? They just rationalized it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an element of legendary growth that, you know, if you want, I don't think that we necessarily need to defend the idea. We don't need to account for a shared hallucination, because I don't necessarily think that we need to accept that they all had this same hallucination. Maybe one or two of them had these grief delusions, and of course they saw Jesus because they were familiar with Jesus. Or maybe it was one of these Elvis Tupac sightings that got around to them, and they started thinking, well, maybe he's alive after all. And then they started developing this brand. They had to modify their extant beliefs in what the Messiah was supposed to be to try and account for this new information. Like, it's true that they never expected that the Messiah was never supposed to die. He was never supposed to rise from the dead. But they thought that their guy had done this. So they had to, out of whole cloth, come up with this new theology to explain this unexpected development.
Because they didn't want to be wrong, you know?
I don't know. Yeah, it could be that.
In part. They didn't want to be wrong.
And I can get that, but what about, we know that Peter, we have really good evidence for Peter, Paul, James, the brother of Christ, and James, the son of Zebedee, dying for their faith. Would you die for something that you just didn't want to be wrong about?
Elvis, maybe not
challenges that there is information on that.
Sean McDowell did a lot of work on that. And he,
People die for their beliefs all the time.
Guys,
So the only thing I was thinking about is, like, when we were talking about the disciples and like them trying to rationalize it after the fact, like where does Paul come into that? Because he doesn't fit into the same category with the disciples. Like, he had no prior relationship with Jesus like they did. He had no reason to be grieving over Jesus. So, like, how is this?
Well, he never met Jesus. He admits in his letters. Yeah. He had a special revelation, spiritual revelation from Jesus. And he was always defending his apostleship, saying, oh, look, even though I wasn't there with him, I still, believe me. And so.
But I guess even looking at the life of Paul, like, how would we then justify his life prior to this, like, encounter that we have? His life prior to when he was persecuting Christians, not just persecuting them, but murdering them, and then also to just radical conversion. Yeah, how would we explain
who knows? That? I mean, it's an evidence for Christianity. The skeptic turned.
It is amazing that the mythicists don't ever just try to make Paul a myth, because I'm thinking that would be
too much evidence that he existed.
You think?
But like you said,
even for them,
the 500
for them.
Yeah, at least 6 of the 13 Pauline epistles are authentic, and that's common consensus.
Okay.
But the 500, we can't. The problem is we can't interview those people. We don't have any hostile witnesses. These Gospels had a theological axe to grind. So we have a highly biased account. And we'd like to get hostile witnesses. That's what you like in history. We'd like to get it close to the events. This is 40 years after the fact. Who knows what.
But we've already covered that. When it comes to ancient, nobody beats the New Testament. There's not one ancient event that comes anywhere near 4 decades.
How about Apollonius of Tyana? You all read the book about Apollonius of Tyana. He was supposedly rose from the dead. He was teleported across the Mediterranean from Caesar's court. Why isn't that true? And he was right after Jesus.
No, contemporary. He was born around the time Jesus was born, and he got.
Yeah. So why would you doubt? And he had disciples, and it's almost parallels Jesus.
The accounts that we have, though, date
3rd century.
3rd century. So are they copying the life of Jesus? I mean, Apollonius, 3rd century is great for them, but the New Testament, 3 decades is, that's ridiculous.
That's a good point.
So it's the case could be made that they were simply copying a successful Christianity at that point.
It's all relative. I mean, we have today we have much more access to recent historical events. Even Joseph Smith, for example, we know in much more detail about his life.
True.
And the history surrounding it and following it than we know about Jesus' life, I would say. I mean, just because of modern historical, the press and whatnot, which they didn't have back then. So it's all relative. You can say, well, compared to Apollonius of Tyana, yeah, it's lacking, but if God is in charge of the whole affair, then he could make it so that it was day one. There was, photographs or, magically photographs back in the first century.
Well, let's do this because we kind of are running out of time and we're already over time actually. But we got this last video clip is a short one, and then we'll do that one and then wrap up some final comments or questions or what have you. You ready?
We don't have much time left, but you believe in an exclusive monotheism as opposed to Bart Ehrman's inclusive monotheism, that, angels and whatnot can be included in that divinity, and it wasn't as hard and fast as the Jews, made it out to be that. Can you kind of address that issue about why you believe it's such an exclusive, that Yahweh was alone worthy of worship?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that every single Jew of the Second Temple period was a strict monotheist, because you can find inscriptions in Egypt where a Jew praises a pagan god for giving him safe travel across the sea. So again, remember those Christians who don't always believe in the Trinity? Okay, so I'm not saying every single Jew was a strict monotheist, but what I'm saying, in a lot of the literature we find, the bulk of the literature, certainly that reflected in the New Testament, which is a type of Judaism, and a lot of the Second Temple literature from the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we call the Pseudepigrapha, and also from what Roman writers say about Judaism, the impression you get is not simply monolatry, worship of one God, but they believe there is one supreme being, and although there are lesser spiritual entities, demons or angels or whatever, they are not on the same ontological level as the God of Israel. Now, that is not to say that prior to the Second Temple period, that the Hebrew people had a different conception of deity. Did it evolve from henotheism, belief in a pantheon with a supreme deity, into monotheism? I'll be honest, that's just not my area of expertise. That's a whole different field of Hebrew Bible, historical Israel, and ancient Near East. So I'll leave that.
Where you had Yahweh being the supreme God and develop it into a monotheism.
Yeah, that area is debated, but that's kind of not my area of expertise, and I think it would be amiss of me to offer judgments and comments on that. But certainly, I think within the Second Temple period, you get an overwhelming sense of an exclusive monotheism. And one of the texts that people point to is from 1 Enoch, where you have the kings of the earth bowing down to I think the Son of Man figure. Now, Richard Balcom says, well, this is the exception that proves the rule, that figures. But I'm more likely to go with Larry Hurtado here. Larry Hurtado says, well, this isn't kind of really divine worship. It's more like obeyance of kings come down and bow down and treat him in a godlike. And this is the biggest thing I've discovered, and I think Bart would agree with this, is that in the ancient world there were two conceptions of deity. You could see deity in an ontological sense, in terms of godness, but you can also see deity in terms of a type of relation. So if you have a saving relationship to someone, the highest form of reciprocation they can give you is divine worship. Okay? And this, to me, explains why people like Philo could talk very, very strongly about absolute. Not Theo, it's my son. Philo talks about, there is one God, one God, one God, one God, and then he'll call Moses a second God. What do you mean? How does Philo do that? He says there's one God, there's one God, there's one God, and then he says, oh, Moses was the second God. But if you look at the context, he's talking about Moses as the deliverer of Israel. In that sense, as a deliverer, he has a God-like relationship to the Hebrews. So in an ontological sense, Yahweh is the God of Israel, but in that relative sense, in that honorific sense, Philo can call Moses the God of the Israelites. Now, people want to say from that, well, obviously Philo is inconsistent, or he doesn't really believe in strict monotheism. Now, I definitely think Philo is a strict monotheist. But, much like others, he understands there is this relative or honorific sense of deity you can ascribe. I mean, the best example I can think of, a modern example, again, to go back to the movie The Matrix, when Neo helps out a guy get some computer program, the guy says, thanks, man, you're my own personal Jesus Christ. Now, I don't think the guy really thinks Neo is Jesus in the movie, but because he's done that saving deed for him, it's like you're my own personal Jesus Christ. So I think that's the best example I can think of. These two conceptions. It's something I've explored a little bit. I may one day write a book on it, on the ontology of divinity in the ancient world. But I mean, you can read things like a good book to read is Cicero's On the Nature of Gods. That's a good way to start, to look at ancient debates or discussions people had about the nature of deity, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff you can read too.
Well, Michael, you're just such an excellent communicator, and thanks for spending this time with us, really. Do you have any words of wisdom you'd like to give to our book club members?
I would do. I think it's fantastic that Christians and atheists can come together and discuss different ideas and just demonstrate that you can live together in peace on a topic that you're both interested in, you're both passionate about as well. Maybe I'm a mediator. I mean, I was an atheist in my younger days. I'm a Christian now, so maybe I'm capable of being a mediator between both camps. But one serious thing we need to do, both in Australia and in America, is we need to be able to have a space, a place to create a country where people of all faith and none can live together in harmony and peace, where we can generally, accept one another for who we are, our freedom to believe what we believe. Where we have freedom of religion, but also a separation of religion from the state apparatus. Secularism in the best sense of it, creating space for people of all faith and none. And I think little communities like you've got here is probably a good way, an ideal way, a very localized way of doing that. So all the best to you and all your book club members.
Well, thank you, Michael. And thanks for stopping by with us.
Okay, my pleasure. And make your second book, the Jesus the Eternal Son. Make that the second book.
Okay. Thanks.
No, it's my pleasure.
Trying to squeeze a second book in there on us.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
But that's a good kind of word to kind of begin to wrap up with, I think. There's a place that we can come together, which we all have passion about. I think that's true. I learn something at every club meeting, and sometimes I think I raise a good question or two. Sometimes, I get a good question I don't know the answer to. So it's something that helps me to grow, helps me to be a better thinker. I'm excited about next month. It's going to be an easy book to read. I think it's an interesting story. I'm so far, as much as I've got Not God's Type by Holly Ordaway, and I think you're going to enjoy that as well. Any final comments or questions? Do we have anything from the Facebook?
Marcel just made a great comment, though. He said, interesting discussions, cool idea for a book club. Love the honesty and civility. Much more of this is needed in our society.
And who's that from?
Marcel?
Marcel, okay. Anybody else? Any questions, comments? Jim, you want to talk a little bit about what's happening with the Atheist Edge? With Atheist Edge?
I thought you were going to ask me to close in prayer.
Wow! And then you can
I'd like to see that.
My family made that mistake one Thanksgiving. You want to hear the prayer? God, if you're really there, thanks for nothing, because we work for the money for this food. I actually said that.
Oh, man.
And they never asked me again.
That would cure me.
Atheist Edge, we just got off, we just did a protest in downtown Dallas. It's all on my channel. youtube.com/atheistedge, and Aaron Ra was there. It was really fun. And I have Richard Carrier coming on the show September 29th.
Yes. What date?
September 29th, live.
September 29th, live. And he's, how many subscribers now?
Almost 3,000.
Almost 3,000. Yes, and something from
Yeah,
online.
John just came in and said, James Walker, I strenuously object to the notion that legends cannot develop within a couple of generations. This common apologetic argument goes back to a brief aside. Sherwin White made in a book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. While apologists like Lee Strobel today seem to think Sherwin White did some extensive study, that was not the case. Sherwin White even wrote that he was only considering the topic of historicity briefly and very generally. His comment on legendary development was based on research by a colleague who had looked at a few famous Greek-Roman figures, which is not very comparable to Jesus, an unknown rural preacher. And there's an and ... but nothing after that.
Okay, he probably has more to say, and I wish we weren't about out of time, but I'm not sure if his point is that it...
He tagged you in it, so
okay.
I know you can get back to it later.
I'll try to follow up on that, but I'm not sure if he's saying by that you don't need 4 centuries for Jesus to become God. That myth can develop within 24 hours or within a very brief period of time, less than a decade. Or if he's saying that we're arguing that the Gospels have to be true because that develop too quickly to be mythology. I'm not sure which point he's trying to make, but it's point well taken either way, and I would like to follow up on that. It's an interesting little study that I've done on the cargo cults. These are religions that sprang up based on natives that were seeing cargo ships and during World War II come in planes to land for supplies for beginning the invasion of Japan, and they thought there were gods there. And to this day, there are religions that are isolated, and they're still making runways and having images of airplanes. So, yeah, you can. And how long has that been? 5 decades? Not long. 6 decades, I guess. Well, no, a little bit more than that. But that developed within just a decade or so. So yeah, myths can develop. You don't need to have a century for a myth to develop, even a religion based on that. That's for sure. Thanks again for being here and being part of the club, and we'll see you next month. Thanks.
Thank you.
Basically, all it takes is one
Group
day.
photo, don't go anywhere.
Fake news.
Yeah, exactly.